On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we speak with Joseph Pearce, a good friend of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, one of the speakers at this summer's Chesterton Conference, a very popular author and speaker and celebrated biographer of G.K. Chesterton. Well, hello again, viewers and listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Uncommon Sense. I am the host for this episode, Joe Grabowski, the Vice President for Evangelization and Mission here at the Chesterton Society. And I'm joined by a very dear friend, great friend of the Chesterton Society, longtime friend and frequent speaker at the Chesterton Conference, Joseph Pearce. Hi, Joseph.
Hello, Joe. Good to be with you.
Likewise, as always. And I got to see you not too long ago when you were in my neck of the woods here in Philadelphia. You gave a couple of talks that were very well received. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. It's always good to get a chance to bump into you. It's good to see you back in Philadelphia.
Yes, and we'll be seeing you again in Philadelphia in just a couple of months' time, and we'll be speaking about that on this episode. I should say for the viewers and listeners, this may be a more interactive episode than you're hoping for, a more immersive episode, because my neighbor is having his roof replaced. I'm in a connecting double, so I do apologize for any like bangs and thumps that you might hear in the background. I try to, get it out in the audio feed, but we'll see what happens. But this is it's an adventure, not an inconvenience, right? That's how we have to look at it. So, Joseph, the upcoming Chesterton Conference is on the theme of faith and friendship, and you're going to be looking at a particular friendship of G.K. Chesterton's. Why don't you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so Chesterton had a great friendship with Hilaire Belloc, and the two were seen so much as comrades in arms, or indeed even synonymously in the case of George Bernard Shaw's famous dubbing of them as the Chester Belloc, two halves of a pantomime elephant. So obviously Belloc and Chesterton were very much people that saw eye to eye with each other with respect to the rest of the world. So this is epitomized, for instance, that there's a whole chapter in Chesterton's autobiography entitled Portrait of a Friend, which is about Hilaire Belloc. So he devotes a whole chapter of his autobiography to his friendship with Belloc. And then when Chesterton died, Hilaire Belloc wrote a book entitled On the Place of Gilbert Keith Chesterton in the English Letters. So Belloc was the obvious person to write that appraisal of the life and legacy of Chesterton. So these were two great friends, and they had a great friendship. So that's what I'll be celebrating at the conference.
Wonderful. And, for my part, I think it's just such a wonderful testament in a certain way to what we claim here at the Society, that, Chesterton is an intercessor for us above, in that one of the things we find in the Chesterton community is great friendship. Tends to be very easy to find. And Chesterton was, of course, great at making friends, even among those who were his opponents. But Belloc sort of does stand out as one of those friends that they do seem very much to be of like mind, not always in lockstep. What would you say to, though, what has been an accusation made by Shaw, famously, but then by some subsequent biographers, that, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, Belloc was a bad influence on Chesterton?
Well, first of all, I would want to distinguish between them being like-minded on the one hand, which they were, and alike, which is not the same thing. So I sometimes make the distinction between what I call Chestertonian charity and Bellocian bellicosity. Chesterton argued without quarrelling. Belloc was very happy to let the argument become a quarrel. And so this is a difference between the two, and a distinction which I think is important. As regards the influence of Belloc on Chesterton, however, I would beg to differ. So, for instance, Chesterton discovered France through his friendship with Belloc and the French understanding of history. Now, this this Francophilia can go too far, and I think in the case of Belloc, it probably did. He was a French patriot, and to see things to demonize the Germanic and canonize the French in terms of history it can be problematic. But I do think that friendship with Belloc it broadened Chesterton's understanding of history in general and European history in particular. And I think that was important. And of course, as Chesterton himself said, that Belloc was the one who introduced the ideas of distributism into the English-speaking world, influenced, of course, by the papal encyclical of Leo XIII. But Belloc was the person that introduced it, and Chesterton referred to himself as a disciple of Belloc. And as distributism is a political philosophy which is not only wise and prudent but necessary, insofar as Belloc was the pioneer and Chesterton is a disciple. That's not a bad influence. That's a good influence. So I basically see the friendship as being a blessing to each of them, but also I think their friendship is ultimately a blessing to us.
Indeed, yes. And it's something Chesterton comments on in his own writings, that there was, particularly at that time in history, I think what, with our reading back into history, sometimes we can tend to be anachronistic and it's easy to forget, but there was sort of a general sort of sentiment in the intelligentsia, let's say in England at that time, that was a little bit, shall we say, close-minded and very much distinguishing sort of the British Empire, the Britain and Europe, right? And whether it was Belloc's influence primarily, I don't know that it was. I think it was just Chesterton's broad learning primarily, but then Belloc certainly reinforcing that kept him sort of open-minded in particular ways to, say, like the Latin warmth in Catholicism and things like that. So I agree that it seems on balance to come out to have been a salutary influence, to the extent that there was influence in that direction. But what about in the opposite direction? We don't hear as much about that, but what could be said maybe for Chesterton's influence on Belloc?
Yeah, so in my biography of Chesterton, I talk about the fact that the balance of power, if we like, as regards the relative influence of one upon the other, switched as Chesterton and Belloc got older. So, when they first met in 1900 at a meeting to oppose the Boer War, the war in South Africa, and that was the beginning of their friendship. Belloc was already married, already had children, was already a published author, had served in the French army, had trekked across the large chunks of the United States, was someone on the brink of walking to Rome, the famous path to Rome that was not far in the future. So Chesterton at this point was not published, was not yet married, and I think that Belloc was a bit like an older brother, and brought to Chesterton's life a level of experience of life which he had not actually had himself. And I talked about the Francophilia. I think that's important because as well, the English were racist, if you like, what you want to use that provocative word, not only in the sense that the British there was a Pax Britannica and the British Empire was the la creme de la creme, but also there was this that the Brits were German, Anglo-Saxons, right? So there's this bond with the Germanic against those Latin types, and that, of course, is a hangover from the anti-Catholicism. So Belloc being so pro-French and having a French perspective, I think did allow Chesterton to jettison a large part of this Anglo-Saxonism. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Tolkien was a great Anglo-Saxonist, and I think that I am. But I do think that we need to overcome this sort of Germanic snobbishness that Northern Europe is superior to the Mediterranean types. That's clearly something that we have to get beyond if we're going to actually become fully Catholic and civilized. So, but then as their friendship developed, I think that Belloc began to lean emotionally on Chesterton. I think that Chesterton's wisdom I think his charity, I think quite frankly his sanctity, his holiness, was something that Belloc was aware that Chesterton had, to a degree which he was also aware he did not have. And I think that as time went on, that Belloc became emotionally, I would say, dependent. But he would lean, I think, on use Chesterton as a support, an emotional and spiritual support. And when with the story of Belloc weeping inconsolably at the funeral of Chesterton, I think shows the extent not just of the depth of their friendship, but I think of the profundity of the sense of loss which Belloc felt in Chesterton's absence.
Yeah, and very much you get the sense from reading the testimony of that him being found. I guess was it in like the rail station bar, crying, weeping disconsolately over a mug of beer. That it was very much a personal loss. He was certainly mourning, and he wrote eloquently about the loss of this great light from the world. And all of us had lost in a way when Chesterton went out of this life, from a certain perspective anyway. But he did very much seem to have kind of a personal sense of loss there in a life, frankly, that was all too much marred by that by that personal pattern of loss. Belloc certainly kind of had quite a cross to carry in that way. I think another place where maybe the critics go awry, though, is in this presumption that Belloc is sort of he's either a necessary cause, or even they would say a sufficient cause. He may be to some extent necessary, but of Chesterton's ultimate conversion to the Catholic Church. And yet, as you point out, they meet in 1900. And I think this is maybe just part of the popular cant about the subject, because people read Orthodoxy and think Chesterton's already Catholic, but he's not. He waits until 1922 to finally enter the church. So, what about that dynamic? What about the influence that Belloc had, but also the independence that Chesterton had in the process of conversion?
Yeah, I think it's not either or. I think it's both and. I do think that Belloc's influence on Chesterton allowed Chesterton to see the Catholic thing, as he would call it, much more clearly, and than was the case had been possible before. One can only imagine the many good, solid conversations that Chesterton and Belloc had together over a few pints of beer or a few glasses of wine, discussing Catholicism and history and heresy and theology. Belloc would definitely have been an influence. But of course, Chesterton is larger than that, right? He's not merely going to become a Catholic because he has a friend who's a Catholic. We do see by 1908, as you say, the publication of Orthodoxy, Chesterton, to all intents and purposes, is a Catholic by this time. The delay, I think, has more to do with his relationship with Frances, his wife. He didn't want to take that giant leap without her. In taking that giant leap without her, there's then an abyss, if you like, that separates you from your spouse, and that's obviously something that Chesterton was understandably reluctant to take that leap without her. In the end, of course, it says great deal for his faith that he did take that leap without her, and then she bridged the gap afterwards by becoming a Catholic herself. But no, I think that basically, if you look at Chesterton's writing, even from his earliest essays, he has a natural inclination towards what he would later come to see as Catholicism. This sense of gratitude, the sense of humility, the way that Thomas Aquinas connects the necessity of humility to gratitude, and how those two are necessary for the sense of wonder, and how the sense of wonder opens our minds and hearts to the fullness of reality through contemplation. That's something you see, if you like, this almost part of who Chesterton is From the first time we see him writing in 1900, the fact that it doesn't necessarily solidify and incarnate itself into communion with the church for a number of years. The point is, it's there embryonically in the Chesterton, he's first published in 1900, which is why those of us that love his writing, we really, it's seamless. Right, we don't see a pre-conversion Chesterton, a post-conversion Chesterton. We might see a younger Chesterton and an older Chesterton, but basically there's a seamlessness about the man and his philosophy, which is there before he formalizes that with his relationship with the church.
Hmm. Well, switching gears to a different topic here. Well, not a different topic, but a different kind of angle of approach. Sort of one of the things that I think is a misperception created by, there's so many misperceptions in that caricature, and it is a caricature of the Chester Belloc that Shaw wrote. It is a delightful article, and I'll try to put a link to it in the show notes for readers that are unfamiliar. However, you have this image of Belloc as sort of the pugnacious and as you say, the bellicose, and that's certainly true. And then Chesterton, on the other hand, sort of the lighthearted and sort of, you could almost suspect, more poetical by nature. And yet the odd thing to me is that in their poetry, right, where Chesterton seems most to shine is in the rambunctious and the noisy and the bon vivants and even battle joy, right? Whereas Belloc, I think, excelled much more at sort of that deeper vein of poetry that speaks to the heart and speaks to the deeper emotions. Maybe bring out, just for our listeners and viewers, without spoiling your talk, obviously, but just that side of Belloc with whom they may not be familiar if all they get is sort of the caricature.
Yes, I'm really pleased you brought that up, Joe, because this is crucial. I think that's in poetry that we can get the depth of the soul, but whereas ironically, for the most part, Chesterton's poetry is somewhat shallow. I think largely because Chesterton was a jolly journalist and he wrote everything in haste. And you can get away with that if you're writing an essay for a newspaper. If you're writing a poem and you don't go back and rework it, there are going to be some pretty poor lines in the midst of it, which is a flaw which hampers the reading experience. Right? If you have a couple of lines that jar, even if the rest of it's wonderful, it's like listening to a song, but two or three of the lines are sung off key. Right? Even if the rest of it's wonderful, you go, what, that wasn't quite what it should be. But whereas Belloc, on the other hand, there's an element of melancholy, and certainly the element, I would say, of mysticism, an element of introspection. So the complete opposite of this man who's just like a maelstrom, like a walking tornado, who's going to pick a fight with everybody he meets. Obviously, there's a depth to Belloc which you see in poems such as Tarantella, where this is a man who thinks deeply about the deepest spiritual realities, feels deeply about the deepest spiritual realities, when he says there's nothing worth the wear of winning than laughter and the love of friends. Now, on one level, you think, well, that's typical Belloc. He just wants to have fun with his buddies, right, and have a few beers. But you think about nothing worth wearing than laughter and the love of friends. Superficially, it seems superficial, but you go deeper. What is laughter and the love of friends ultimately but an inkling of the beatific vision? That when we die, we won't just live happily ever after, we'll live happy ever laughter. That the joy, as Chesterton says at the end of Orthodox, that there's a secret mirth that Christ hides from us on earth. And certainly humor is part of the Imago Dei. So Belloc, he has this deep sense of melancholy, this deep sense of longing, I think, ultimately for heaven. His longing for friendship is also a longing for heaven. The whole idea of a no abiding city here. There's no abiding friendship here either, because we're going to be separated by death. That if there's an abiding friendship and an abiding laughter and love of friends, is to be found in the hereafter, not the here and now. And I think we see that in Belloc's poetry. The man's a mystic. The man's a romantic. The man's melancholy, not in a self-indulgent, narcissistic way, but in the way of one who understands that he's seeing through a veil of tears, living in a valley of tears and seeing through a veil of tears, and a land of exile. In other words, it's the melancholy of a mystic, of a Christian mystic, and we have to understand Belloc in that profundity if we're going to understand him at all, and realise that he brought that profundity to his friendship with Chesterton.
Yeah, and I think Belloc's beautiful reflection on friendship from The Four Men is so worth reading for anyone out there who maybe is unfamiliar, but there's this period where they're speaking about the worst thing in the world, and one of them thinks it's an earache, but the old man, the wise one, Grizzlebeard, has this beautiful plaintive meditation on the loss of friendship, and particularly friendship when lost because it just grows like stale, or you almost have this image of embers in a fire quietly losing their heat and succumbing to ash, and it's quite heartbreaking. It's such a it shows a depth to the man that I think again we would be well served to rediscover.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned The Four Men, which is one of the most delightful books ever written, one of my favourite books ever written, and I've written about it, and I do see The Four Men as being different aspects of Belloc's own personality. So if you want to understand Belloc, you look at The Four Men, because Grizzlebeard is the historian, the Catholic, the one who sees from the perspective of millennia, of centuries, the old man. But then you have the sailor, the adventurer, and Belloc did sail a boat. He wrote a book called The Cruise of the Nona. He loved sailing. But of course, it's not just sailing. The sailor's also the person who's going to walk to Rome. He's the adventurer, right? And then you have the poet. And we talked about Belloc as a poet. And of course, myself is just the device whereby the narrator strings it all together. So, it's a marvelous book, fun to read, rambunctious, but also, again, having this great depth of mystical melancholy.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a few kind of stock questions that, as we lead up to the Chesterton Conference, we're trying to get speakers on, and I'll sort of start to wind down with these two questions as that we're asking people without spoiling your talk, obviously. Maybe from the ancillary research as you prepare for it, or what have you, something that maybe is going to end up on the cutting room floor, not make it into the talk, but what would you say is either a surprising part that people might be surprised to learn about, let's say, your topic, Chesterton and Belloc and their friendship, or a part that you wish you could find room for in the talk, but it's probably not going to make it in there?
Well, you do me a great service of flattery in thinking that I've thought about the talk at all. I mean, generally speaking, I think about the next speaking engagement, whenever that is, and so I won't give too much thought to what I'm going to say at the Chesterton Conference until a few days before it. Probably, obviously, I know Belloc and Chesterton well, and I'm confident I can wax, hopefully eloquent and lucid, for 45 minutes or so. But I can't tell you what's not going to be in it, what's going to be in it, because I don't know myself at the moment. But certainly, that my approach will be to interweave the two men, to show what they had in common, what they do not have in common, and might even compare and contrast their relative gifts. I mean, who's the greater poet? Who's the greater novelist? Who's the greater essayist? Who's most misunderstood and why, and perhaps in relation to their relationship with each other. Was Belloc the bad influence that many people say he was, or was he a good influence? Was it a mixture? So this is me sort of thinking of the approach I'd like to take. I'm going to try to bring some humour into it as well. I mean, both men were so rumbustious that we really want to bring that dimension into it. The belly laugh as well as the philosophy. So as H.G. Wells said, that he resented the fact that Belloc and Chesterton had placed a boozy halo around the Catholic Church. So I certainly intend to accentuate the importance of the boozy halo, and so that will probably be part of the talk. So I hope it be full of the joie de vivre and the conviviality which both men had as individuals and as both men had in their relationship with each other.
Great. And that mention of conviviality leads me into the question we'll have last here, which is we're asking the speakers, especially those who have been to Chesterton conferences previously, and you've been to quite a number. You're a regular at the Chesterton Conference, as I said in the introduction. For those out there on the fence who have maybe never been, at least never been in person, maybe they've tuned into the talks online, give us your best elevator pitch. Why come to a Chesterton conference?
Yeah, well, I actually used the Chesterton Conference as an example of an article I wrote very recently called Remembering the Forgotten Chesterton. So there's a well-known journalist in the United Kingdom called Simon Heffer, and he wrote something recently with respect to Chesterton's 150th anniversary of his birth, that basically, that he's dated, no one reads him anymore, and he's sort of out of sync, out of step with modern England. I basically used the Chesterton Society Conference, the Chesterton Conference, as proof that Chesterton was not forgotten. I've said basically, he's far more of his books are in print now than ever before. But I said, that the Chesterton Conference is one of the largest literary conferences in the world, and it's lively. And so I used it as an example. So what I would say is, I travel a lot, and quite frankly, I've been on the lecture circuit for a quarter of a century now, and I'm getting old, and I'm getting tired, and I'm getting fed up with it, and I'm looking for an excuse to travel less. But there are one or two events on the annual calendar that are sacrosanct, that I wouldn't want to miss, that I'm always going to be happy to go to for as long as I have the energy. And the Chesterton Conference is certainly up there with the best of the best. It's not just because you can immerse yourself in all things Chestertonian for a few days, and that in itself is good. You can immerse yourself in Chestertonians. And Chestertonians are a certain type of person. They're full of that conviviality, that joie de vivre that the man himself was full of. And so they enjoy each other's company. And the talks are great. But I do think it's the conviviality and the legendary afterglow, right? When the formal event is over, well, all the talks have been said for the day. People just gather for ale, wine, conversation, conviviality, and the convivium at the end of each day's events is something to be experienced and something not to be missed. And if you haven't been, then you certainly are missing something. And that all comes together climactically, if you like, in the banquet with which the event ends. And I can honestly say that, generally speaking, in the 2 or 3 hours of the banquet, I will not laugh as much in a short period of time again until the following banquet the year after. It's all about laughter and the love of friends.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Viewers and listeners, I do encourage you to follow Joseph, follow his work. He is prolific in writing articles and books and giving talks, all sorts of things. So you can find Joseph online at jpearce.co. That's jpearce.co. We'll have that link in the description and in the show notes, or you can click the card up in the corner of the screen here. And you can join what's called the Inner Sanctum, which gives you the ability to support Joseph in his good work, but also the ability to gain access to special perks for those that are his patrons. We do need to patronize the arts, and by that I mean the humanities more generally, especially in this day and age that puts such overemphasis, I would say, maybe on the mechanical techne of the world and the creation of widgets and gadgets rather than the creation of goodness, truth, and beauty. So I do encourage you to check out Joe's website, jpearce.co. Joseph, always a pleasure, and I can't wait to see you again in just a couple of months.
Yeah, it's a joy to meet you virtuously, but I'd much rather see you in the flesh. And I'm looking forward to it when I come to the Chesterton Conference.
Indeed. Well, God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you.
And for you, viewers and listeners, God bless you. Please do pray for us as we continue to pray for you. You can support us however you like. Please do subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, share it with your friends, leave a comment. All of those things help the algorithm feed this to other people that are going to find it interesting. And we are in the midst of a campaign where we're trying to raise new support, regular monthly financial support for the work of the apostolate. You can learn more about that by visiting chesterton.org. And clicking on the Give button or the Knights button up in the corner. That's chesterton.org. And of course, please do go and sign up for the conference and come out and meet Joseph, meet myself, and meet all these other wonderful speakers in person, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Until next time, I'm Joe Grabowski. God bless you.